Professor Ison, thanks very much for agreeing to have this conversation with me today. To introduce you, Ray, you grew up in a farm in Australia, and you talk in some of your writing about that was a really important kind of perspective on getting into recognising the world was systemic. You studied agricultural science, and in 1994 you joined the OU, you're Professor of Systems there. And your work, I feel, has really focused on systems thinking in practice. So it's very much about, if the world is systemic, is made up of systems, how do we use that insight to do something useful in the world? So welcome, lovely to see you.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I wanted to start really with this this kind of question about ontological stance. You know, where do people come from in their thinking in these kind of areas of complexity in systems? And there was a sentence in Wikipedia that really leapt out at me, which I think is a good encapsulation of perhaps where you come from. It is not the earth we seek to save, but a viable, healthy, ongoing, co-evolutionary dynamic between humans and the biosphere in manifest, localized and situated ways. I think that's a beautiful sentence. And I wondered if you could expand a bit on what you might call your ontological stance.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a nice question. I mean, clearly we're a species, and in the sort of vernacular of nature, we are part of nature. We are part of the biosphere, an integral part of the biosphere and a product of evolutionary dynamics. But we've acquired a place in the biosphere which is quite unique, unfortunately unique perhaps, in that we are sentient beings, we live in language, we have assumed great powers over technology, and our capacity to act and influence is such that we now talk about living in a what I call an Anthropocene biosphere, a biosphere that is essentially being formed and changed and altered by human activity. And of course, the COP event in Glasgow was all about that. Now, to have an ontology about the world, for me, has to start with me, the observer, or me, the explainer. You've got to explain me and the act of giving explanations as a first starting point. And I think we humans have, ended up in a very bad spot because of the way we understand ourselves. And that's through particular models of cognition, limited explanations of Homo sapiens as Homo economicus through economic theory, failure to understand how explanations operate in social life, and of course, how scientific explanations operate in social life and as part of the world, including how we choose to explain the biophysical world. And one particular trap, which we could come back to, is an, I think, false pathway, is that we've tended to treat the environment as something outside ourselves, as an externality in economic language. And so therefore, we think of operating on the environment or adapting to the environment. Whereas my understanding, derived from backgrounds in agriculture, is that we live in relationship with each other and in relationship with the biosphere. And so it's the issues that are of concern to me these days are about the question about the quality of our relationship with the biosphere and how what we do unfolds in particular trajectories.
So, yeah. So the underlying principle, I think, is that the world is a kind of socio-environmental, political weaving, interweaving. It's woven at right down to the deepest level. It's not an environment and a society that kind of abuts, but they're interwoven, as you say, from the local kind of upwards. And I think you're also describing how our thinking becomes an act, that our thinking, our being, as well as our actual, well, drives our doing. And that is part of the real world. It isn't a sort of separation, it's part of the real world. And I really like the way you go back to this kind of local, because I do think sometimes people think in terms of like couple systems, as opposed to the fact that here we are on our farm or in our community, and it's the local interweaving of the relationship between the environment and people and the political in the context of the bigger that really is building up these kind of patterns, these systemic patterns. Have I got that right?
Yes. Well, again, I think we've haven't done the best we could in environmental education, because we've often provided educational programs about the environment out there. Yeah. Whereas I use the metaphor of the snail. I mean, a snail lives in its shell and its existence is coupled to its shell. I mean, our environment is coupled to us. You know, we're on a digital environment in living in language at the moment, but we can't escape the air we breathe, the ambience of what's going on, and the implications of talking in English as opposed to talking in Chinese, for example, which carries different unfoldings. But yeah. I mean, and we might get onto this in one of your later questions, but to say everything is related to everything, which is a sort of systemic big notion, doesn't get you very far. So what I'm really interested in is how you can take purposeful action to change things for the better, with a view to maintaining a more coherent or a higher quality relationship between us and the biosphere.
Yeah, so it has a purpose.
Yes, so it has a purpose, so that you can act purposefully to try and do that.
Yeah.
And so that's, and it's then when explanations of the biosphere, of ecologies or of dynamics between other species, and where complexity theory and other things have, and cybernetic theory and systems theory have a lot to offer, because they explain relational dynamics and other types of things and patterns, as you've talked about yourself. And it's important to understand those. Yeah. But I like to think that one of the things we can do is step outside the patterns we ourselves create for ourselves.
Yes. I think that the next question really relates to this idea of patterning, that as you said, it isn't just that we're saying that everything is connected to everything. The reflexive interconnectivity creates more localized patterning. There's a particularity about some of that patterning. And I was really attracted by what you said in that systems event a couple of weeks ago we were involved in, where you said we should start with the situation. And I really like that, because it cuts away, you know, is it a system? Is it a this? You're saying, let's start with where we are in this situation. And I wondered if you could give some examples of where you've done that and what you mean by that.
Well, I've done a lot of work in river catchment governance and issues, and in the fields of hydrology and others, for many years, the whole field of river science, if you like, and hydrological science has framed rivers as geologically or earth-related or biophysical systems, and they, in their framing choices, when they've not been open to the social dimensions of rivers, that rivers are inhabited by people with livelihoods who are trying to pursue purpose and extracting too much water or etc., etc. And so there's been what I call a framing failure, a failure to frame our situation, our circumstances appropriately to what they are. People carry with them theoretical frameworks which they impose on the situation, rather than being open to the circumstances and arriving at an appropriate framing choice for that given situation.
Mm.
And this is where I first started talking about coevolutionary dynamics. It makes a lot of sense for me to understand a river system as a coupled social biophysical system, because it's humans in relationship to the river that's a really important one. And a very simple measure of quality would be, when I was growing up in Australia, we would have no hesitations as children or our parents allowing us to swim in rivers all over the country. Rivers were pristine. It was before agricultural chemicals were widespread, etc. But these days, most people would have second thoughts about allowing their children to swim in a river. So we have lost an important aspect of being human in our relationship with the biosphere, because we're not able to experience the phenomenon of swimming in a river, right? Because it's a manifestation of a whole set of historical decisions, patterns, qualities, chemicals, etc.
So that historicity, that understanding that things have come from somewhere, they're particular to their context. If you can understand that interweaving and that historically shaped patterning, then you're able to decide how to act and see that co-evolutionary dynamics. Which I was thinking that one of the things I feel is sometimes a bit of a difference in emphasis between a complexity perspective and a systems perspective is that emphasis on the dynamic, which you do include, and the fact that that what emerges next may be radically different. It may not be something that we expect. And how does your practice kind of in a sense take account of the fact that the future, things may be emerging that are not what we have anticipated? Do you how does that kind of fit in?
Yeah, no, it's an important question, and for a long time now I've spoken about managing for emergence. So I don't believe in anything that we do, particularly that we can guarantee that we can do very much deterministically. Because that's a sort of what I call systematic thinking, simple cause and effect thinking, and most of that ends up being unproductive or running into problems because the systemic complexity is ignored in the decision making. So, but I do think that you can engage, part of engaging with a situation and being embodied and situated in your practice, you can be open to exploring the situation systemically and to think about some of the relational dynamics as best as you can, drawing a boundary around what you take into account and what you don't, because you can't take everything into account. And by trying to understand situations systemically, you can preclude systemic failure to some extent, or you can try and ameliorate the possibility of breakdown. You can draw in multiple perspectives on the situation, which gives what you do more robust characteristics. And you can get clarity of purpose. I mean, one of the biggest difficulties we have in localized action is the lack of clarity of purpose. And I mean, this is particularly apparent in, say, centralized command and control government systems, whereby central government develops a policy, prescribes what should be done. It's rolled out, a phrase I hate and detest, into because it crushes local self-organising capability. And so it may well be the role of government to say these are phenomena of concern and we need to address them as a society, but how you do that needs to be unpacked and explored collaboratively in localised and contextualised ways, so that how you do it matches purpose, because only there will you know the historicity, the relationships, the dynamics and other things that are necessary to become effective.
Yeah, brilliant. And before I take us into that issue of governance, just to go back to that point, I sometimes wonder if, as well as getting people to think systemically, to take into account the kind of particularity and the flow, and to use some of that in a kind of foresighting way, to do your best to imagine, you know, what you're dealing with, and in the service of how you see your purpose. But I sometimes wonder if we focus enough on saying to people, do you notice emerging shoots of change? Do we attune people to noticing what is emerging? You know, that even when we get them to think systemically. I wondered if you had a view on that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question in preparation for this event, and it reminded me of a story, an experience I had in South Africa. I was on a flight to, I think, East London just in 1994, just after the apartheid elections, and I was sitting next to someone who'd been in the emergency and fought, been part of the ANC resistance to apartheid, and we were coming into land, and I was looking out the window. He was sitting beside me, and I suddenly felt his body disposition change dramatically. It was shifting emotion and other things of that nature. And I turned and said, "What's wrong?" Because I was looking out the window and I couldn't see anything that perturbed me. Mm. And then he pointed out a gun emplacement and a control tower that had been used in the apartheid regime by the military to contain control and other things of this nature. And him seeing that had changed who he was and opened up a conversation and a history that I didn't have access to. Mm. And so we all live in our own traditions of understanding out of which we think and act. And it's only by then that conversation I can have with that other person that I get insight into that particular situation. I wouldn't have seen it. I wouldn't have been open to the circumstances if I hadn't discerned his changes in body disposition. Yeah. So I think the question is, we always need to create experiences and bring in others that open us up to those possibility of seeing emergent shoots. Yes. To get back to your question.
Yeah. So yes, it's recognizing that multiple perspectives being attuned, knowing that some people will see things and experience things that you wouldn't have done. But I guess it's also about looking more widely. So it's a bit like people did know that there were likely to be pandemics, but if you're an economist looking over here, you don't necessarily look wide enough to notice that there are things that are going to radically shift the economy that are kind of outside your focus. So I guess part of it's also about boundaries. How do we attune ourselves to looking for the unusual and not get blinkered by, you know, our disciplines or our measures, or, you know, or even our project focus sometimes?
Yes, well, I mean, the too often public policy is drawn with the wrong boundaries, and that's why debates about purpose become important, because that's what a system does. I mean, it either achieves its purpose or it doesn't. And so many of the failings in the last 2 years have been failures of what I would say they are systemic failures, but they're systemic failures because there has been no purposeful system put in place where there has been clarity of purpose.
Yeah.
Or there's been distortion of purpose. Yeah. For political or other ends.
Yeah. Or to put it in a slightly different way, that the system that we've built and the way we see that and its purpose doesn't marry the systemic nature of the socio-environment, economic, etc.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. So, no, our explanations are out of date, and that's part of the arguments in the book that we're going to talk about.
So to get on to the book, which so I have here, and is beautifully written and very, very interesting. It's really interesting to think about, what does this all mean for governance? How do you govern? This of all the big questions that we're in at the moment, it has to be the biggest, doesn't it? Here we are, you know, after COP 26. What would you say about how do we have to approach systemic governance in this world that we live in at the moment?
Well, the starting point is that we've got to be able to have a conversation like you and I are having. Seems very hard to start a conversation about governance because many people have a very narrow interpretation of what governance is or how it can be understood or framed. And the way that Ed and I frame it in the book is essentially a sort of cybernetic model of governance, which is about how you can understand coevolutionary dynamics or feedback processes, which are central cybernetic and systems ideas. And I mean, it goes back to the root of the Greek metaphor that informs cybernetics, meaning to steer. It's about essentially how humans chart a coevolutionary course into the future, given our propensity to do what we do. And with the knowledge that many other species have gone extinct as well. So systemic governance for me has two dimensions. One is that you can ask the question, how might we understand what we currently do in the name of governance as if it were a system? And what are the elements in it? And how did those elements come to be? Are they still fit for purpose? What's wrong with them? What's right about them? And what's missing from this set of elements and their relationships? And that's the first part of our book. We explore a particular heuristic which looks at the relationship between the state, civil society, private sector, the law, the media, and argue that in very simplistic terms that the relationships between these and their component parts and their histories and their different subsystems are one way of thinking about governance as a system and the relationships between them. And we then unfold why many of the design features and historical elements and historical institutions that make them up are no longer fit for purpose and why they're not working effectively. Because when these arrangements were put in place, they were put in place for a world that doesn't exist anymore. And there are many, many other things now happening in the world which these relations are incapable of dealing with. And we then make an argument to add three new elements to our ways of thinking and talking about governance. And those three are driven by putting the biosphere as absolutely central rather than as an externality, as economics tends to do. So everything that we do has to be connected to the biosphere, including future coal mines, etc. We have to take responsibility for the impact we humans are having on what some people call the technosphere. We have littered the Earth with billions of millions of tons of stuff. There was a program on the BBC last night which talking about how cement would be, if cement were a country, it'd be one of the biggest carbon dioxide emitters in the world. It's cement making and cement manufacture emits about 8% of the global CO2. So that's part of the technosphere that we humans have lathered the surface of the Earth with. And we have a very limited, I think, understanding of how technology functions and how we might engage with better regulation or better design of technology. So that's the technosphere. And the third one is social purpose, how we invent institutions that are more attuned to collaborative, distributed, citizen-driven articulations of social purpose and aggregated into higher level governance systems. And a lot of our book is devoted to ways in which that might be done. But in the first instance, we've got to develop a way of having a conversation about it. And that my experience of the book thus far, given it's been out about a year, is that it's difficult to get a conversation going about it and to get people to accept an invitation to think of governance in systemic terms. So that's the first part of systemic governance. The second part is, having thought about a new system of governance, how do you inhabit the new system of governance? And that becomes what I mean by systemic practices. How do you inhabit that with systemic thinking, systemic sensibility, systems literacy, systems thinking and practice capabilities, such that the enactment of the governance system can achieve the sorts of things that you're looking for, and don't constantly fail, or don't lead us in trajectories that don't seem particularly viable.
Yeah, well, what I love about it is that you include, you start with you know, it all starts with me and my relationship with myself and how I understand that, right through to how do we deal with the biggest thing that we're faced with as a globe, as a planet. And I think that's really important in systemic thinking, that it's both about the micro and the macro and everything in between. I wonder what you'd say to citizens, you know, that there's a kind of issue about how do ordinary people, frustrated with the power dynamics of, you know, of government and big business, you know, how can, this is an unanswerable question, I realize, but, you know, how can we all, you know, as citizens, try and impact these very, what seems sometimes like very locked in power dynamics, and vested interests that seem impossible to kind of destabilize? I just wonder what you'd say to that.
Well, I mean, it's a big challenge. It's a very difficult, I mean, one has to look at, say, the new world nations like Australia and the US. And I mean, citizens left a Europe that they didn't find very conducive to themselves at that time, and they cooperated with each other to develop nation states. So they invented constitutions and they created nations, often at the expense of Indigenous people, unfortunately, and they failed to appropriately accommodate Indigenous worldviews and understandings, which is a great tragedy. But nonetheless, citizens were able to come together and do things which led to certain outcomes. So we've done it in the past. We've invented, if you like, governance systems. A governance system is an invention. So everything that we've got, but we tend to treat them as immutable somehow, that they can't be changed. Britain could have a constitution. It doesn't have one, but it could have. Yeah. So, I mean, so there are groups around who come together and talk about constitutional reform and other things of that nature. So that's one possibility. There's one set of experiments going on in Australia whereby it goes under the umbrella called Voices for Indy. So it's trying to innovate within the current governance system rather than changing it. But the way in which candidates are selected in a given electorate is a completely bottom-up, self-organising local process by which they then call for nominations of candidates and citizens select them. And they are operating then on behalf of citizens rather than on behalf of parties. So there are different models around, and in the area of, if you like, by our engagement with the biophysical world, there's some interesting stuff going on with regard to river governance, where in the Waikato in New Zealand, the government's given the Waikato sentience. It said the Waikato has personhood, therefore it can be dealt with by laws, therefore you need a spokespeople for the Waikato, and the Waikato enters into our conversations about how we act in relation to it. So there are, in different parts of the world, innovations that are going on. So we should always try to take some comfort that that is possible, that's happening, but it's not happening nearly fast enough. And we need to join them up more. And I guess we may be on the cusp of a change. I mean, for the best part of the last 50 years, and particularly under neoliberalism, everything we have done has treated people as consumers. We've never treated seriously people as citizens. And we haven't developed their citizens' capabilities and sensibilities in ways that we need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A very final comment, which is perhaps a slightly negative note to end on. You said at the beginning, and I have some sympathy with this, species do go extinct. And, it is possible that because of locked in issues of power and entitlement and vested interests, our societies as we see them, our constitutions may collapse. We may actually be facing a collapse. We are on the cusp. It feels, we may turn this round. We may help citizens to feel empowered as citizens, not consumers, and so on. But how do you feel about that? Do you feel that collapse is a possibility?
Well, certainly the historical evidence is that societies collapse. I mean, there's a long record of collapse, and so it's very, very possible. And we have a lot of very high temperatures and a lot of climatic variability to deal with, and there's no guarantee we're going to be able to deal with it effectively without massive disruptions to life and other things ahead of us. So I get particularly distressed in some of the discourse and the framings around, say, climate change. I mean, you're a physicist and you know mathematics and statistics. I mean, we know that talk about a mean temperature reveals very little. So a 1.5 degree mean temperature change means a tremendous change in the range of variation in the tails of a distribution. And variation in the tails of a distribution, whether it's heat or cold or flood or famine, whatever it is, it's the duration and extent of that variation that will govern us as a species and our food supplies and our living capabilities. So I don't think we've even begun to really internalize and conceptualize for our governance systems how to deal with the data that has thus far been hidden by very blunt modelling, which talks in mean degrees centigrade.
No, well, absolutely. Well, Ray, that's been absolutely fascinating, as I knew it would be. And one thing I want to kind of end on is what you said at one point, which is about the need to educate people to experience thinking systemically and everything that means. That feels like a very important practice for all of us to help people and encourage people to think in that kind of systemic way. So, which of course you're doing as a professor of systems in the OU and through all your writing and speaking. So thank you very much indeed. Lovely to speak to you.
No, it's a pleasure, Jean, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. So good luck.